In this lesson, we're going to be talking about the ray trace type shadows and how they can be used as an alternative to the shadow maps. Alright, so here's where we left off in our previous lesson. So right now we've had a chance to take a look at these depth shadows. So right now with these shadow maps, you can see, kind of as we talked about, these shadow maps render out very quickly. You can see our render time is really just about 1 second in length. But as we had talked about, these shadow maps, or these actual shadows themselves, really don't contain transparency and things like that. So they are fast, but they're not really very accurate. So that's where we can use things like ray trace shadows to give us the effect that we need. So to do that, we can select the light that we were using before. And let's just scroll up to this general parameters. And we'll set it to use, instead of a shadow map, we'll use ray trace shadows. Alright, so you can see really doesn't look like anything's changed. But what we should see now whenever we render is, if I kind of frame up on this pen holder and re-render, you'll notice that we should start to now get some of these actual transparency effects in the shadows themselves. And that's because we're no longer actually generating a map and then laying it over. It actually is casting rays through this object and then seeing where these rays can pass through, and then as a result we get these shadows. So the pro to using these ray trace shadows is that they are much more accurate. The downfall, though, is that they are usually quite a bit slower. You can see, as far as just comparing the render times, we've gone from about a 1 second render using the shadow maps to about a 5 second render now using these ray trace shadows. So we've increased our renders by a factor of 5 by just turning on these shadows. So this definitely is something that you will want to be very careful about using, and really only use it when necessary. Alright, so let's go ahead and take a look at some of the different parameters that can be found in these ray trace shadows. Now once we enable these, we should now get a new rollout. Let me go ahead and just collapse some of these. We should get a new rollout for these ray traced shadow parameters. Alright, and really you can see they're very straightforward. We have the same shadow map parameters, or the same shadow parameters that we had for the shadow map, in that we can control the shadow color, we can control the shadow density, and we'll talk about some of these atmospheric shadow effects a little bit later. But really, if you take a look in these ray trace shadow parameters, they're very, very simple parameters that we have. Just the ray bias, which does exactly what the bias does on the shadow maps. So if this is set to a higher value, let's say a value of 1, we should now start to get some gaps in between some of these areas that are very close together. All right, and you can see that's exactly what we get here in some of these areas. And of course, the higher this value, the more space you're going to get. All right, so any of these areas that are within a certain distance from each other, we get no shadowing effects. But as we get further away from these areas, we actually do get shadows, because they do fall within this ray bias. So again, I always find it to be helpful to try to lower this value as much as possible. And then with the quad tree depth, we have the ability to control how many different surface interactions these ray trace shadows are going to take before they get reported back to the render. So this becomes especially important whenever you're using things like transparent objects or refractive objects or even reflective objects, where you have to make sure that this ray bounces around maybe between a few different objects or surfaces before that ray gets reported back. Alright, so let's look at some of these very simple and straightforward parameters for these ray trace type shadows. Now what we'll start to do in the next lesson is take a look at some of these other derivatives of the ray trace shadows. So we can see we have area shadows, and we also have advanced ray trace shadows. So we'll take a look at those over the course of the next couple of lessons.